The following podcast is a Scrum Inc. production.
Welcome back, Season 2 of the Agile CEO, and I am joined today by my partner in crime at Scrum Inc., Matt Jacobs, who's the Chief Product Owner of our consulting business, who does a huge amount of work both here and overseas. And what we're going to be talking about today is an Agile operating model. So, Matt, welcome. And I thought I'd start with just what's the difference between a traditional operating model and an Agile operating model?
It's a great starting point. Sometimes it's easier to define something by what it isn't. And I don't think there's a such thing as a traditional operating model. Operating models, as the world and context have evolved and changed, operating models have changed. So I don't think there's a singular definition, but we've gone through many different lenses between centralized and decentralized, matrix organizations, a heavily outsourced organization. There's been many different frameworks that have come out over time. So if we flip that and then turn around and talk about what is an Agile operating model specifically, I think an Agile operating model focuses on three things. First, it's really focused on, all right, I've got my organizational strategy and my organizational inputs. I need a delivery engine. I need something that's going to take that strategy and deliver the outputs that I'm looking for, like any good modern operating model should. There's too many people stuck in systems that the best people are the ones who know how to navigate their operating model. Their work is getting done despite the system. So when we look at an Agile operating model, we're really talking about three key levers that we spend a lot of time focusing on with organizations. The first is having an organization that's aligned by customer-driven value. And how do I maintain a golden thread from what is the organization's vision to what is its strategy to what everybody is doing? So if you ask anyone in the organization, they could say what they were doing and why that mattered to the organization. The second is having a continuous improvement system built into it. Today, the world is evolving so quickly. Even if you had the perfect operating model for your context, that doesn't mean it will be perfect for very long. So I need to actually build an operating model that will evolve and change based on the context and situations around me. So how do I build that systematic change mechanism directly into the operating model itself? And the third is that our delivery engine, that pipeline of how we actually deliver value to the customer, is set up in a way that I can deliver in incremental pieces so that I can get the customer feedback that then I can react to, learn, and adjust out what I'm doing next. So that's not good enough to just say the teams need to deliver incrementally. The whole delivery system needs to be set up to enable that.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was talking to a CEO down in Latin America, and he's really interesting CEO. He said, what got me here, like a very successful company, he said, but what got me here is if I want to grow to the next stage, I know I have to change the operating model because it's getting too creaky to move into the next era that he wants to move the company into. So when people do a new operating model or want to do it, what is the transition point? So, oh yeah, I need to change that engine.
So if you look at the numbers out there, depending on what survey you look at, 70 to 80% of CEOs say their operating model will change in the next 4 to 6 years. So it's kind of ubiquitous in the market right now. There's drivers from that, from AI to technology to adoption to post-COVID worker disengagement. And I think as you're starting any operating model transformation, the most important thing you can do is start with the why. Identify what type of organization I want to be and what is keeping me from getting to there today. What is the gap between my ideal organization and my current? Then outline a set of design principles, test things that you can test that will then help you decide, is this helping me or is it not going to help me? So then I can try it. And if you look at most large operating model transformations, they're failing. They're just like big enterprise resource management transformations. They're massively complex. So how do I actually go through that operating model change in a really agile way where I'm getting feedback both from the market and my people internally. Am I doing the right things to help me move to the North Star? Because if you try to pre-plan the entire thing, this is a human system. It's by definition a complex system. You're going to end up failing.
Yeah, we were talking earlier today, designing how we would approach it in one of our customers. And you were just really hard. It's like, don't have the phase where we think about what we're going to do. We analyze it. Then 6 months later, we decided that one of the things that I really appreciate about your approach is that iterative, not just delivery, but iterative development of the organization as you're doing it.
Yeah, we actually had our first customer call a couple of years ago now and say, we're not doing an agile transformation, which, by the way, I think is a wonderful starting point. They said, we're doing our transformation. But as we looked at it and we looked at the data of why transformations fail, we realized that this is the ultimate agile project itself. We need to adopt an agile operating model for the transformation team itself so we can test and learn our way through how we're going to be able to get there. And then we can build some of these agile concepts into the core of that operating model. So what I really appreciated is them being very specific about naming the transformation that they're going through based on the outcomes that they were trying to get to. They didn't look at agility as a silver bullet that's going to solve all their problems. They looked at it as a tool that was going to help them be able to get there.
So let's get into a little bit of detail here. When someone calls you up, and you're the expert on this, and someone calls you up and says, okay, I think I need to do an operating model change. After the why, saying, why do you want to do it? Because don't do it if you have a good reason. But what are the questions you ask? What are questions that CEOs should ask themselves?
I think they need to look at the system today and talk to the people. What's getting in the way? And you can start this because it can help you find your why. Is going, what's getting in the way from delivery? What are those big systematic problems? Or some organizations, and I think most organizations are going through empowerment, or they want to create systems that can help remove blockers for employees. Sometimes actually the system's been so bad for so long, people don't think the system itself can change. So they're not even good at identifying where the problems are anymore. Is almost changing the question around slightly and say, hey, where are you working around policies and procedures? To start to identify where's those breakages, where are people operating despite the system, not because of the system. From there, you can start to go on and be like, all right, then what do we want to be? What do we want to try? And with a lot of our organizations, we try to get a baseline of how they are against that future state that they say, and then actually design a series of experiments. What are the things that we think we can do that we think would make us better here? And then don't try them all at once, because then you won't be able to isolate what's making a difference and what is not. Choose a few of them, move out, get understanding, and then figure out where you want to go next and what is good enough. And now we need to shift our focus over here to over there.
So how do they measure what success is? Because how do you say, okay, I'm doing this operating model and I want it to have business outcomes. How do you measure, but that's not going to happen overnight. How do you measure your path towards that?
Yeah. So it's a standard question that we end up getting. I think you started to steal the first part of my answer by the way you asked the question. But the first question is, I went go identify a bunch of new metrics. Like, what is the point of the organization today? What does it value? And at the end of the day, if those things aren't getting better, then the operating model change is not actually helping. It's not enabling delivery. So start with your current outcomes. A lot of times, though, that's a lagging indicator. What we look at is kind of the tenets that we've defined as an agile operating model. So we look at prioritization, customer centricity, delivery, organizational refactoring, or like the organizational structure itself, and culture. With some sub-dimensions in there as starting points is, how do people feel that they're good at these organizational outcomes that their system should be producing? To then start to identify, all right, we don't have a big issue with the way we're structured. We have a big issue with the way we go from vision to strategy to backlog. Or as we just started one and started asking people this, and actually some of their main customers, the customer came back and said, no one ever has asked me for feedback and how well the system's supporting me. Clearly, they had an issue with customer centricity. So if we can agree on those high level outputs, at least it gives us a starting point to understand where we're at today. And then we can actually monitor it throughout and tell us, all right, do we feel in a very structured way that we're getting better against these things before we then can get to better organizational outcomes? It tends to be a little bit more of a leading indicator of where is the system itself healthy versus where it's not.
And one thing we've run into a lot, and I just did this with a company where they said, yes, we're really great at prioritization and impediment removal. And then you sort of dug into it and they weren't. It was sort of this self illusion of competence.
Yes. I don't care what the executive team thinks in isolation. One of the things that we see actually, and we measure, is at different layers in the organization, because we may have different problems. Because the executive team feels like they're highly aligned, it's irrelevant if the edge doesn't feel like they're highly aligned. That perception is reality because they're going to feel it very, very differently. So like a lot of times working with leadership, we say, until people tell you to stop reciting your organizational vision and strategy, you haven't said it enough.
Yeah.
You just keep repeating it over and over again. Someone will eventually tell you to stop. That means you probably only need to say it 4 or 5 more times. So that's why we want to look at it at different systems. One of the things that it's actually been really interesting that started to happen recently is actually the top leaders and the employees delivering the work actually have a very common aligned view of the state of the organization. That leadership team is just as frustrated with how the system is working as the employees delivering the work. Where you start to get to this weird disconnect, it tends to be somewhere in the pressurized middle.
Yeah, when we do, our agile health assessment, there's like this radar of how different levels of the organization, view certain things. I always love it when those are really different, because it's like that's where the issue is, that you think everything sounds like it's aligned, we're all rowing toward the same shore, but you're not. And getting that data and pulsing through and seeing how that changes. That's one of the things I really like about the health assessment that you helped create, because it does take those dimensions and sees where the organization is. And it just, as you said, the dichotomy there, or trichotomy, I suppose, is interesting. But so when you're rolling one of these out, and it's starting to go along, and we hear this a lot, that CEOs have that frustration you're talking about. They want things to get better. How do you give them the levers to steer their organization in a better way? Because we've run across a lot of CEOs just like, I know I want to do something better, but I don't know how to actually steer the organization.
Yeah, I think one of the first things you have to do is realize as a leadership team that a core responsibility is designing the system and the engine that's actually delivering your organizational strategy. If you have the world's best strategy and no system to deliver it, it doesn't really matter. It's like being on a race car team and having the best race strategy, but if your engine in the car can't put out the horsepower, it's irrelevant if you have the best strategy. Like an actual story to bring that to life, we were working with an organization that builds robots. And it had been in the research phase for a really long time, a very academic organization. And kind of looked at 2 of the leaders who've been there for a long time and asked, like, how much time do you think about the system that's delivering the robots versus the robots? And they kind of looked at each other and smiled because they knew the answer. They're like, 98% of the time, they spend thinking about the robots, and 2% actually the system that delivers the robots. So it's like, what happens if we balance that out and win like 80-20? Like, why don't you take that actual system level thinking that you do with the robots and apply it to the organizational structure itself? And it was kind of like an aha moment. They were systems thinkers. And they decided, it kind of dawned on them that they own that operating model. It's very funny to me when we're working with an executive team and they're like, well, this leader doesn't have a lot of time to think about this. Like, we're delegating that. And it's like, to this transformation office. It's like, that's okay, but like, isn't that a core responsibility of leadership to build the system that's going to deliver the strategy. So I think that's like the first step of making sure leaders understand that they have the levers, and that's a core part of their responsibility, is enabling the delivery of their strategy.
Yeah, it's interesting you said robots, because when, right as my father was developing Scrum back in the early 90s, he was his office was right near MIT. And this group from the Media Lab came over and said, hey, can we sublet some space? And it was the group that eventually founded iRobot. But they had this robot, and the very robot is in the Smithsonian. And I live in DC, and I've seen this robot. It's called Genghis Khan. And when it was shown to my father, he said, all the systems of systems were exactly what it's about. But the other thing is they had very simple rules. So every time you turned it on, it would be like all of a sudden like wobbling around, trying to walk, and then it would quickly learn how to run. And he said, because you have to constantly be learning. And that was the thing where my father actually tells the story. It's like, he saw that and said, well, what if we did that for people? And Rodney Brooks, who's the professor and founder of iRobot, said, well, that would be interesting. Why don't you try it? My father's line. So I did. It's called Scrum.
And I think Scrum answered this point at the end, or that's how a lot of people looked at it. What I actually think is really interesting is how much those worlds are really converging right now. And that's where most of the modern organizational psychology is leading, is building kind of your organization almost like you're building software or robots. And it's been along for a long time, kind of first into the IT space, this thing called Conway's Law, which says like actually the product you end up delivering is just a mirror of your organizational structure. So now what you're seeing is organizations take advantage of that. And Amazon's a great example of this, where the whole organization is set up around microservices that have independent paths to production. That one component doesn't break the rest of it. That learning center coming from the edge and bringing it back to the center, and the center is really there for kind of a coordination and a prioritization aspect. So you're seeing the inverse of Conway's Law starting to come to life, which is organizations are starting to be built like software products and starting to mirror much more of those layered and actually that true system level thinking to how we structure our people.
And I think it's interesting because one of the things that I think people took out of Scrum was that it was just a team level thing. That this is how you have a small teamwork rather than, as my mother tells you and I regularly, no, it's about delivering business outcomes. The whole organization has to do it. And so you run across a lot where people have just done this team level stuff, but they're not getting the outcomes that they want.
Yeah. Well, I find this really funny, because actually I've seen almost negative value be created by a lot of team level Scrum. Because especially if you haven't changed the operating model, those teams are existing despite of the organization and the system that's around them. So like you really need to build an ecosystem that the teams can live in, that's enabling what you're asking them to do at the ground. You actually walk into some of these organizations and they're sick of being told to do Scrum or any other kind of framework. There's an organization not supporting them in what they're doing. So it actually started as a net positive and got people excited. They're looking back and going, what is the organization doing to support me in this journey? Or I've got these issues that aren't team level issues. How do we look up? What do I do with these? Where do I go? So to me, these two pieces need to be moving very much simultaneously. It's kind of one and the same. And that's why my Agile operating model needs to meet the Agile team level, or I'm going to run into problems.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting when I was speaking at Defense Acquisitions University a couple months ago, and they actually had some research that had come out where actually just training somebody in how to work in a new way is detrimental, as you said, to the organization, because they have got this new skill set. They can do all this new stuff, and then they go back into their ecosystem and they can't do it. It's impossible for them to do it.
And sometimes too, like if you think about it, like if you launch Agile teams, one of the things that an Agile team, one of the baseline assumptions is that it's a product team. It has something that it can deliver end to end. Well, if my teams aren't structured that way to begin with, like it doesn't really make sense. So for us, like one of the most important steps is actually having a product-based architecture. And if you look at a lot of kind of new operating model, not just Agile, is more how do I be value stream aligned? One of the things that really slowed down many organizations is dependencies. And people ask me this question all the time, kind of in an agile operating model or just in general, like, how are we going to manage dependencies? My really flippant answer is don't have them. Dependencies are the problem. Why are we designing a system to manage them? Actually, how can I try to structure as many of them out as possible? And if I'm going to have them, how do I try to keep them more localized? And actually, I can use that to actually identify where the operating model needs to change and evolve. So if I'm in a situation where if I'm mapping all my dependencies in the organization and I have a team over here constantly reaching out and to a different team across the entire organization, I know I have an inefficiency here. Right. I should draw them a little bit closer together. And I think one of the reasons dependencies break organizations is actually an alignment problem. I'm asking you to do this to help me, but you have your own set of goals that may not be aligned. So now we're just rushing to wait and hand each other work that sits there and then doesn't come back, and then it just causes frustration.
One thing I wanted to ask you about during this recording is right now you're designing this operating model for this organization that has a bunch of sort of sub-organizations, each of which is doing pretty well individually, but it's not acting as a system of systems. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work you're just doing this week.
Yeah. So one thing in any agile organization is, or I think actually in a lot of kind of current transformations, is getting people to look up. It's not about my priorities, my team's priorities, my team of teams priority or small business units priorities. It's actually what matters to the organization. A lot of people have absolutely no idea. So I need to be really transparent about that. And if we take the kind of the issues of the dependency, if everything is so interconnected and we don't have aligned priorities, everything then dies at the handoff. I'm not going to deprioritize my thing to go help somebody else because we don't have the same view and common set of the world. To be able to get to a common view of the world, we need to step back and say, actually, what do we value? Because we see at many of these organizations, it's like, well, should we invest in product A or product B? Or I need this type of internal investment to buy this system, and this person needs this machine. And they're trying to do these trade-offs. And they're actually arguing about value indirectly through something else, which is the investment choice that's being asked. Instead of stepping back and going, what do we value as an organization? Do we value our B2B customers more than our B2C or vice versa? Like, that's actually what's driving the fight. The fight isn't, should we invest in this hardware piece or should we invest in this product line? The fight that people are having indirectly is, what do we value as an organization? Which type of customer is more important?
Yeah, and it's the other piece that you've talked a lot about to me is when one part of the organization learns something, but they're in their little operating unit, and even though they come up with a solution, but that isn't go across the entire organization. So everyone's coming up with different solutions for the same problem.
Yeah, so you have this delicate balance between centralization and decentralization. So one thing before we get into fully answering that question is a lot of organizations worry about duplicating effort or rework, but they spend significant time and effort trying to avoid the rework or the duplication of work, to the point that to avoid the rework or duplication, they did significantly more work than was required. Like, maybe that's not the number one concern. If I look at actually macro effectiveness, and there's many organizations out there, if I'm moving really fast, it doesn't matter nearly as much. I can actually afford a little bit of rework or duplication because the overall speed of the system is significantly higher. And then I can have more edge innovation and let the best ideas float up. If you're going to operate that in that way, though, you need to make it part of people's jobs. An expectation is to make their job better, or their team better, or their system better than when they inherited, and be rewarded for that, which means they get validation and recognition, which means they're going to be more incentivized to share and push that across. So you want to have very specific mechanisms built into the operating model to radiate that knowledge, but first you need to incentivize and actually make that a core expectation of the organization, that continuous evolution is one of the core outputs and ways that the organization is measured.
So are you saying you shouldn't be more efficient, Matt? I mean, isn't that our entire thing? I'm just joking.
Be more effective, not efficient.
Exactly. So I guess what you're saying is part of it is how do you create a learning organization that can continually learn, but you have to reward people for doing that. And when you're working with organizations, they have an incentive structure that doesn't necessarily reflect that behavior. Sometimes I just feel it just doesn't work, but they're so hesitant to change the incentives.
Well, you can't actually incentivize agile ways of working without changing the incentive system. Like, that's why I think a lot of agile transformations fail, is I've done this team level thing, or I've done this system level thing, but I never changed the whole operating model. The pieces that immediately start to boil up in every organization who does this is, how do I do my budgeting and finance? Like, if I'm doing a yearly annual plan and I've funded everything and I can't change it, how can I be agile? If I'm rewarding individuals over teams and then individuals over the system performance, I'm actually disincentivizing people to act as their team. So you actually need to change my core governance and policies to reward the behaviors that we're looking for. And we tell people when they're thinking about organizational change, they're like, oh, we want to do a culture transformation. Well, culture is really a manifestation of the systems. So if you have an issue with something in culture, you should ask what's driving that. Oh, we don't have a lot of cooperation. Well, you have a highly individualized bonus system based on core output metrics. Well, how are you incentivizing cooperation? You may want some group level bonusing or something built into that. So you actually need to have an incentive structure that aligns on that continuous improvement. Part of like your model in question and kind of the employee review or recognition should be built around, all right, how did you improve the system? How did you make the organization better so that it can deliver more value in the future? Build that directly into the recognition and award structures.
Why is that hard, do you think? Because people really have a problem with that. It's very difficult for people when they're doing a new op model to go into sort of the real wiring of their organization.
I'm not exactly sure. I think it's probably an underestimation of what's required, or they're trying to do it in the beginning and it seems too daunting.
Right.
This could be a piece. Why don't we start to move into ways of working and ask, what's disincentivizing you? Where are we getting weird behavior? And don't try to delete. We were working with an organization who approached us. They had spent 2 years, and I don't know how many millions of dollars, pre-planning their future org. They redesigned it. They wrote all new policies and procedures, down to actually work papers about how people would do their job. None of it was real. And then their goal when they approach was like, can you help us get there? We have committed to the board that we have 3 months to bring this to life. It's like, and they were trying to say they wanted to be more agile. There was like the antithesis of agility. They did a waterfall style transformation.
Yeah, I remember you telling me about this.
And we essentially said, no, that's not going to work, or that's not how we view the world. And we thought it was going to be a colossal failure. So like, don't try to pre-plan that. The other story I'll tell around this is right before COVID, we were supposed to start working with a large asset management organization. COVID hit and they said, hey, we're going to pause this transformation work. We don't have any of the digital tooling for work from home, et cetera. So we want to make sure like we can do a video conference. We can get people's laptops working. I was like, totally understand. We'd have to work with you remotely. And then we were about to hang up the call and I was like, wait a second. No. Like, there is so much change that needs to happen. Why don't we do this transformation really, really quickly? Focus it on the continuous improvement path and let people say what's getting in their way the most from being able to work from remote and prioritize those things. Let the organization prioritize what it needs to be able to deliver. And it actually really accelerated their transformation because that was the focus, because it was helping them get through COVID.
Yeah, it's using agile to get the results. I think that was like the key there. And I think that's very much like one of the groups we're working with in the UK, where they're using agile teams to drive and test the operating model continuously. And it's not that agile is the outcome that they want, is they want a better learning operating model, and they happen to be using agile teams to do it.
Yeah.
And one of the things you talk about in recent weeks is using agile as a suffix rather than a prefix when you're starting to do one of these things. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because you and I have certainly discussed it a lot.
Yeah. So first and foremost, this was not mine. And anyone who knows me well, using a grammar joke or analogy would not be part of my core personality. So Martin Barlow, thank you very much for this. And if you had gotten it from someone else, you can pass on the recognition later. But it's a context of, if you're saying, I want an agile finance process, it's putting agility as the point ahead of what you're doing. If you're looking for a finance process that can be more agile and adaptive, you're putting the goal in front of the method of how you're going to be able to get there. And I see this massive movement kind of in the agile space to move agile back to the background. It's the tooling. Let's lead with the outcome, which then relates back to the beginning of our conversation. Like, if you're going to be doing any sort of transformation, being really clear at the why and keeping that up front. Agile is just part of the tooling. It's just part of the way that we get to the results that we're trying to get to.
So I think I'm going to wrap this with the question I ask everybody. It's interesting because I'm pretty sure I know what your answer is. But what would be your advice if the CEO is sitting in front of you right now saying, I'm thinking about doing this? What's the one piece of advice you would give them to think about as they do?
Well, just so you know, I'm going to turn around and ask you what you thought I was going to say as I delay here and think of my answer, because I have many ideas, some of which are even helpful. I think my piece of advice is be committed. This is not going to happen overnight. And I think every single transformation, agile transformation, outsourced transformation, matrix transformation, they all lose their way because the transformation becomes the point. Is check yourself frequently. Are we moving towards the goal and outcome, or are we putting the method first? And I could never been part of a transformation at some part at a deep moment or a dark moment. That wasn't the case. So build in those checks and keep reminding yourself, because you will end up doing that. And make sure you quickly recognize and pull up, is this actually helping me get to my originally stated goal and purpose?
That's pretty much what I guess you would say. And it's really interesting because in season 1, I asked that question of, Brad Freitag at Claris, or Ganesh, American Airlines, and they are one of our favorite clients, Gwen Jenkins and Sir Gwen Jenkins in the UK. They all say the same thing: commitment, the leadership, commitment, and engagement through all of it is what's going to drive success.
Yeah, they own the operating model. I think the other word that makes me cringe is in any organizational change when someone uses the word implement, like it's a piece of software. Like, all I have to do is implement this. Like, I can upload it into people's brains and then everything will just function. What we're talking about as humans, which are a complex system, it's something that we're going to evolve towards, we're going to work towards. There is no implementation because there's no real starting ending point. Like, actually, how can we put an operating model in place that we never need to do an operating model transformation again? Because it's self-corrective, evolutionary, and adaptive in its very nature.
Well, Matt Jacobs, Chief Product Owner of Scrum Inc. Consultant. Thanks a lot, man.
Thank you very much for having me, JJ.
The Agile CEO is brought to you by Scrum Inc. In today's fast-paced world, adaptability is key. Our expert consulting services tailor transformations that drive measurable success, creating resilient, high-performing organizations. Whether you're leading a team, managing an organization, or guiding enterprise-level change, we're here to support your journey. Transform with confidence and achieve the outcomes that matter. Learn more at scruminc.com.